So, organized religion in China to me takes two different paths. One path is a very public path, and the other path is about your private life or your private thoughts. And so, when I think of the introduction of religion, right, into Chinese culture, I always think about them being very, very practical about having these two different ideas or two different paths that govern what they do. The first path, the public path, is related to Confucianism. And many people talk about Confucianism the way they talk about Buddhism. Is it truly a religion or is it more of a philosophy? And again, I think it's up to you to decide whether you look at it religiously or philosophically. To me, these are the spiritual underpinnings of their country. So it doesn't really matter to me which word you use, but you get the point. And Confucianism was founded by Confucius, or as he was originally called, Master Kong. And here we are inside a Confucian temple with an image of Confucius. And once again, I point back to Buddhism and say, the way the Confucians sort of view these images is not that it's a god. I think it's more this idea of it's reminding them of the person they're following, the person who illuminated their path. So just like Buddha's not a god, Confucius is not a god either. But again, there are temples dedicated, right, to celebrating him. And when I think of Confucius, I think of him offering a path or a framework that people could follow. And I give you a little bit of dialogue here, right? That Confucius's beliefs deliver a different kind of peace than nirvana. It creates peace amongst mankind itself. If everyone follows the same social code, there should be no dissent. So, what does this mean? When you look at what Confucius professed, he professed that basically there was a role for every Chinese person to play based on their status, based on their position in the hierarchy, where they were in the social, right, status, right, of their village, let's say. And from the top to the bottom, right, everybody had a role to play. But that person would be better off understanding that they couldn't step outside of that role, that role defined them. And if they followed the rules, right, they should get along just fine. So if you read like Confucian literature, different fictional stories that have a Confucius background to them, you'll often hear dialogue from the characters talking about, I do what I do according to my station, I do what I do based on my role in society. It mimics a lot of the Indian caste system belief, right, that there's a role to be played. But what Confucius was sort of saying is that this gives peace, knowing where you belong, knowing what you're supposed to do. And basically, Chinese used this to create the ranks that they all filled, right? The jobs that they did. Again, it gave them a sort of sense of stability, right? And placement. And for many Chinese, that was about understanding your value and your worth within the society. Confucian law sort of governed everything. It governed what kind of clothes you wore. It governed how many times you had to bow when you came in a room, right? If you saw someone of higher station than you. Certain colors, right, were only available in clothing for certain statuses. So everything was governed by the sense of order that Confucianism could give. This true sense of, again, there's order and you must follow it. This is also why we believe that Chinese culture is very reverent towards elders, and believe very strongly that those above you in age, right, were always to be given respect. There's the famous question that's asked. One of my favorite questions to ask my students that really lets them understand that Western culture is different than Asian culture. It's a question about being on a sinking boat, and you can either save your mother, your mate, right, or your spouse, however you'd like to define that, or your child. And so I asked the class, like, who would you save? Would you save your mother? Would you save your love, right, your mate or your spouse? Or would you save your child? Invariably, the Western classroom chooses the child because we've sort of been raised in this culture of like children are so important and they're innocents and they're fragile, and that's not what Asians would answer. Asians would answer that you should save your mom, your mother, because she cannot be replaced. That she is the ancestor, right? She is the beacon in your tribe, essentially. She's the head of your family. And there's no replacing your mother. Like, there is no mother that can be replaced. They're like, say what you will, but you can replace your mate. You go find another love. And they said, you can have another child, but you can't replace your mother. So for them, this idea of honor, right, it really reads very differently than Westerners think about the concept, I think. But again, there's this structure to what they do and a structure to how they view even their own families, their role in society. And Confucius, that's why I call it sort of a public philosophy, because it's all about wearing the right face out into culture, wearing the right face out into society. And if you know Chinese culture, there's a famous saying that, they do what they do so to save face. Losing face in Chinese culture is a big affront. It's something you don't want to do. You don't want to lose face. So this idea of following Confucian principles and keeping the order in your society, you don't lose face if you follow along correctly. I always tell a story about when I was living in China and how everything was very ritualistic, to the point where a Westerner wouldn't understand. I went to a table one time where some older professors were sitting and they had an extra soda because everyone was always served family style. And I said, are you going to have the soda? Would you mind if I take it? And they were like, no, we're not going to drink it. And I was like, oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and left with the soda. And then the person who was kind of our go-between was like, oh yeah, no, that wasn't enough. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you probably gave some offense there because you're supposed to ask a couple different times. They're supposed to tell you yes a couple different times because they're older than you. It's not ask once, be told, and thank them and walk away, which is what we Westerners do. So, I lost a little face that day. But again, I'm not raised in that culture, so how was I to know, right? But again, everything's very structured. Confucius was also known for his sayings. So this might be how you actually know Confucius. And they always start with Master Say. And supposedly they were written down by his students later on. So just like as with like Platonic thinking, we often talk about like how much of this is really what Socratic thinking. We often wonder like how much of this is truly what the person said, right? Or was like later Plato when he wrote down Socrates saying, was he embellishing? We'll never know, right? So a lot of these are orally transmitted through the years. And with Confucianism, it actually becomes a little even more complicated because later emperors will actually not like Confucian thought, and so will kill off Confucian scholars. So, there's even, we always say, some holes there that, are we really hearing what Confucius said? But it's the best we have, right? But this idea of Master Say, and these different types of statements about life and how to live life and, how to do so appropriately. And so I picked this one for you because, Master Say, to study without thinking is futile. To think without studying is dangerous. For the purposes of our course, I think this holds great weight. If you study something without thinking about it, well, that's just futile. Like I often think about my students who just briefly look at the study guide, like real quick. They look it over like, oh yeah. I'm like, you're not thinking about it. You're just looking at it. Like you're not going deeper. You're not connecting to the information. And then you don't do well on the test. It's not surprising because you're not doing a deep dive or a deep understanding. You're studying without thinking. To think without studying is dangerous. So sometimes people just throw out their thoughts, right? Just say whatever. They don't really study the topic. That's also very dangerous as well. Like you have to know the principles behind something before you can actually speak on it. So he would have these little pithy little sayings, almost like bumper sticker type of, thoughts. But I think that, again, they help to guide right society and give them a moral compass, right? A way of understanding their role that they're playing. And as I said, Confucius has temples, right? So you can look at various Confucius temples, and I feel like they function very much like Buddhist temples, that they're a place of remembrance, right? They're a place of kind of reflecting on Confucius. This is the world's largest statue of Confucius in China. So again, he's honored but I'd argue that it's not meant to be godlike, right? But when you look at a statue like this, you sometimes are like, really? You know, is he not supposed to be a god? But again, I think for even modern day Chinese, they look to this idea of Confucius as guiding, right, the system that they live under, and that they don't mind having sort of these stricter rules about, sort of cultural attitudes or what's appropriate. When I was in China, I was very struck by the fact that their culture was not really about improvisation. It wasn't about freedom in a lot of ways, but it wasn't something that they minded. It was something that they felt, again, culturally stuck them together like glue, right? And really gave them a way to understand each other along the path of their lives. The next thing we're going to look at is the private path, right, which is Taoism.